Hi, I'm Betty, and I need to tell you about the day my world turned upside down. I was 68 years old, sitting in my kitchen, when I heard my granddaughter Jessica say something that broke my heart. I hope she dies before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. Then I'd get the inheritance too and could plan the wedding I actually want. Those were the words that changed everything. Words spoken by my own granddaughter about me. Words I was never supposed to hear. I was sitting in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, going through the final wedding bills for Jessica's dream wedding, when I heard her voice drifting from the living room. She was on the phone with someone, and her tone was casual, relaxed. She had no idea I was there. "I can't wait until this wedding is over," she had started, and I paused, my pen hovering over the vendor invoices spread across my kitchen table. "Grandma keeps trying to give her opinions about everything. It's so embarrassing. My friends keep asking why she's so involved in planning my wedding." My heart started to sink, but I told myself she was just stressed. Wedding planning could be overwhelming, especially for a 24-year-old. I kept listening, hoping she'd say something kinder. "I wish she'd just pay for it and stay out of it," she continued. And I felt like someone had slapped me. Here I was, looking at $80,000 worth of contracts, all signed in my name, all my responsibility, and she saw me as nothing more than a nuisance who happened to have a checkbook. But then came those devastating words that I opened with. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at those vendor contracts scattered across my kitchen table. Every single one bore my signature. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography, the music, all in my name, all my choice. Then I heard her laugh. A sound that used to bring me such joy. I know it sounds awful, but she's gotta have at least $1 million saved up. If she died now, I'd get that money plus not have to deal with her interfering anymore. I quietly stood up, walked to my home office, and pulled out my business filing cabinet. 20 years of running a restaurant had taught me to read contracts carefully. As I flipped through the wedding agreements, I realized something that Jessica had never bothered to understand. I wasn't just the grandmother paying for this wedding. I was the primary client on every single contract. I picked up my phone and smiled for the first time in weeks. It was time to make some calls that would change everything. But let me start from the beginning, so you understand exactly how someone I loved more than life itself could wish for my death while I was spending my life savings on her happiness. Because what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, dignity, and learning that even at 68 years old, I still had more power than anyone realized. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories like mine. My name is Betty Richardson, I'm 68 years old, and I live in Springfield, Missouri. I've been a widow for 3 years now, ever since my husband Harold passed away from a heart attack. Harold was a good man who worked hard his whole life, and when he died, he left me well provided for with life insurance, our savings, and our house that's been paid off for over a decade. Jessica is my son Michael's daughter, my only granddaughter, and honestly, she's always been the light of my life. She's 24 years old, works as a marketing coordinator at a local company, and got engaged to her boyfriend Brad last year. When she called me crying with joy about the proposal, I was so happy for her. Now, I should tell you something about myself that becomes important later. Before I retired, I owned and operated a family restaurant called Betty's Kitchen for 20 years. I learned how to manage vendors, read contracts, handle business relationships, and deal with all kinds of people. I wasn't just some sweet old grandmother who didn't understand how the world worked. I knew business. When Jessica got engaged, she and Brad started planning what they called a small, intimate wedding. They had saved about $5,000, which would have gotten them a nice ceremony at the local community center with maybe 50 guests. But Jessica kept talking about this dream wedding she'd seen in magazines, with beautiful flowers and an elegant venue. One evening, she was at my house for dinner, flipping through bridal magazines and sighing. "I wish we could afford something like this," she said, showing me pictures of elaborate receptions. "But I guess we'll just have to make do with what we have." That's when I made the decision that I thought would bring us closer together. "Sweetheart," I said, "what if Grandma helped make your dream wedding come true?" The look on her face was pure joy. She hugged me so tight and called me the best grandmother in the world. We spent the next month planning together. Jessica's dream wedding would cost $80,000. I know that sounds like a lot, but I could afford it. Between Harold's life insurance, our savings, and what I'd put away from the restaurant, I had the money to give her this gift. I put down $15,000 in deposits and signed all the vendor contracts as the primary client. The beautiful country club venue, the elegant catering with a 5-course dinner, the professional photographer, the florist who would create stunning arrangements, even the string quartet for the ceremony. The remaining $65,000 in final payments would be due 30 days before the wedding. My son Michael and his wife Karen seemed so grateful. They kept thanking me and saying how generous I was being. Karen even said, "Betty, you're making dreams come true for our family." I felt so proud to be able to do this for them. The wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks away. Everything was planned perfectly, all the deposits were paid, and I was so excited to see Jessica walk down the aisle in her beautiful dress. I thought I was giving her the most wonderful gift a grandmother could give. I never imagined that she would see my generosity as interference, or that she would wish I wasn't around to see the wedding I was paying for. But I was about to learn some very painful truths about how my own family really saw me. About 2 months into the wedding planning, I started noticing subtle changes in how Jessica treated me. It began with small things that I tried to brush off, telling myself she was just stressed about the wedding. The first real incident happened during a meeting with the florist. I had suggested adding some white roses to the bridal bouquet, because they had been my wedding flowers, and I thought it would be a sweet way to connect our generations. Jessica's face immediately soured. "Grandma, that's so old-fashioned," she said, rolling her eyes right in front of the florist. "We're going for a more modern, elegant look. White roses are what people used in the 1950s. I felt embarrassed and hurt. But I told myself she was just being a perfectionist about her special day. The florist looked uncomfortable, and I quickly said, "Of course, dear, it's your wedding." But the dismissive attitude continued. Every suggestion I made was met with, "That's not the vibe we're going for," or "My friends would think that's weird." When I mentioned that many of my friends were excited to attend, Jessica frowned and said, "We need to keep the guest count manageable, Grandma. Your friends won't really fit in with our crowd." I was paying for everything. But apparently my opinions, my friends, and my feelings didn't matter at all. The worst part was how she started excluding me from important decisions. One afternoon she had scheduled a cake tasting with the baker, and when I arrived at the bakery, I found out the appointment had been moved to earlier in the day without anyone telling me. "Oh, didn't I mention it?" Jessica said when I called her. "We had to change the time and I figured you didn't need to be there for every little detail." But this wasn't a little detail. This was a $1,500 cake that I was purchasing, and I wasn't even invited to help choose it. Jessica began scheduling vendor meetings without me, making decisions about thousands of dollars I was spending, and treating me like I was some interfering busybody instead of the person making her dream wedding possible. The breaking point came when I discovered she had completely changed the guest list. I found out when one of my dearest friends, Ruth, called to ask if she'd done something wrong because she never received an invitation. "Ruth, what do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Of course you're invited. I gave Jessica your address weeks ago." That's when I learned that Jessica had removed not just Ruth, but 6 of my closest friends from the guest list. When I confronted her about it, she shrugged and said, "We needed to make cuts somewhere, and honestly your friends won't really understand the type of wedding we're having." I felt like I'd been slapped. These were women who had been my friends for decades, who had supported me through Harold's death, who had been excited to celebrate with me. But according to Jessica, they weren't good enough for her expensive wedding. "Jessica, these are important people in my life," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "If I'm paying for this wedding, I should be able to invite my friends." "Grandma, you're being dramatic," she replied. "It's not about you, it's about Brad and me having the perfect day we want." I started noticing other things too. When Jessica's friends came over while we were planning, she would get visibly uncomfortable if they asked about my involvement. Once, I overheard her tell a friend, "Yeah, my grandmother is really into this wedding planning stuff. She has opinions about everything." The tone made it clear that my involvement was something to be embarrassed about, not grateful for. Another time, I suggested that we include a memory table with photos of family members who had passed away, including Harold. Jessica immediately said, "That's so depressing. We want people to be happy, not thinking about dead people." I felt like I was being treated as a burden rather than a beloved grandmother. Every interaction became about managing my interference instead of celebrating together. I was good enough to pay for everything, but not good enough to have any say in what I was buying. The pattern was clear. Jessica wanted my money, but she didn't want me. She saw me as an obstacle to her perfect day, not as the person who was making it possible. And sadly, Michael and Karen never stepped in to defend me or correct Jessica's behavior. They seemed to think that as long as I was willing to pay, I should just accept whatever treatment I received. I started dreading our planning sessions instead of looking forward to them. What should have been a joyful time of bonding with my granddaughter had become a series of rejections and dismissals. But I kept telling myself that once the wedding was over, things would go back to normal. I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. 4 weeks before the wedding, I was supposed to meet Jessica at her apartment to finalize the wedding favor choices. She had asked me to come by at 2 p.m. to go over the samples together and make the final decision. These were small silver picture frames that would cost about $8 each for the 150 guests. I arrived at her apartment building around 1:45 p.m., wanting to be on time. Jessica had given me a key to her place last winter when she had pneumonia and needed someone to check on her and bring her soup. I'd kept the key because she said it made her feel safer knowing I could get in if there was an emergency. As I walked up to her apartment door, I could hear Jessica's voice through the thin walls. She was clearly on the phone with someone, speaking in her normal tone, not whispering. I realized she had no idea I was there early. I quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside, planning to wait in the kitchen until she finished her call so I wouldn't interrupt. But as I stood there, I couldn't help but hear what she was saying. "Sarah, I'm so exhausted from all this wedding planning," Jessica was saying to her maid of honor. "And the worst part is dealing with my grandmother." I froze. She was talking about me. "She keeps trying to give her opinions about everything," Jessica continued. "The flowers, the music, the guest list, even the wedding favors. It's so embarrassing. She has these old-fashioned ideas about what a wedding should be like." My heart started to pound. I knew I should leave, but I couldn't move. I needed to hear what she really thought about me. "My friends keep asking why she's so involved in everything," Jessica said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "They think it's weird that someone her age is so into planning a young person's wedding. Like, doesn't she have her own life?" Sarah must have said something because Jessica laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was mean. "Exactly," Jessica said. "I keep trying to hint that she should back off, but she doesn't get it. She thinks because she's paying for everything, she gets to have opinions about every little detail." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Here I was, spending my life savings to give her the wedding of her dreams, and she saw me as nothing more than an embarrassing burden. But it got worse. "I wish she would just write the check and disappear," Jessica said, and her voice was getting more animated, like she was warming up to complaining. "She's ruining my perfect day with her constant input. This is supposed to be about me and Brad, not about making my grandmother feel included." I gripped the kitchen counter, feeling dizzy. After all the planning sessions, all the excitement I thought we'd shared, all the time she'd hugged me and thanked me, this was how she really felt. "You know what the worst part is?" Jessica continued. "She acts like she's doing me this huge favor, but honestly, she's probably just lonely and desperate for attention. Like, get a hobby, you know?" Sarah must have made some comment because Jessica laughed again, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Sometimes I think about what it would be like if she just wasn't around anymore," Jessica said casually, as if she were talking about the weather. "Like, if she died tomorrow, I wouldn't have to deal with all her opinions and interference." I couldn't breathe. My own granddaughter was talking about my death like it would be convenient for her. But she wasn't done. "Actually, that would solve a lot of problems," Jessica said, and I could hear her moving around the room, probably pacing the way she did when she got excited about something. I mean, I know it sounds terrible, but think about it. If she died before the wedding, I wouldn't have to deal with her trying to control everything, and I'd inherit whatever money she has left. I've been thinking about this, Jessica continued, and her voice took on a calculating tone that I'd never heard before. She's got to have at least $1 million saved up. She owned that restaurant for 20 years, plus whatever my grandfather left her. If she died now, I'd get all that money and could plan the wedding I actually want, not the one she's trying to force on me. I felt like I was going to be sick. She had calculated my worth. She had thought about my death and decided it would be profitable. God. Sarah. I know how awful this sounds, Jessica said, but she didn't sound sorry at all. But honestly, I hope she dies before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. Then I'd get the inheritance too and could plan the wedding I actually want. There it was. The words that would replay in my head for the rest of my life. My beloved granddaughter, the girl I'd raised from a baby when Michael and Karen both had to work, the child I'd spoiled and loved and supported through everything, was literally wishing for my death. She thinks she's helping, Jessica continued, but she's just making everything harder. I can't wait until this wedding is over and I don't have to pretend to care about her opinions anymore. The thing is, Jessica said, and I could hear her settling into a chair. She's so naive about business stuff. She thinks because she ran some little restaurant in the middle of nowhere, she understands contracts and vendor relationships. But she doesn't realize that once you sign with vendors, you're locked in. She can't back out now without losing all the deposits. Plus, Jessica added, she's too sweet to ever actually follow through on any threats. She's one of those people who just wants everyone to be happy. She'd never do anything to hurt me, even if I hurt her first. I stood there in her kitchen, holding onto the counter for support, realizing that my granddaughter had not only wished for my death, but had also completely underestimated who I was, and what I was capable of. You know what the funniest part is? Jessica said, and her voice was getting louder with excitement. She signed all the contracts as the primary client because she wanted to take care of everything for me. But she doesn't understand that now she's legally responsible for all the payments. Even if she wanted to back out, she'd lose thousands of dollars in deposits. She's trapped. Sarah must have said something encouraging because Jessica laughed triumphantly. Exactly. She made herself the perfect victim. She's paying for everything. She has no legal way to get out of it. And I can treat her however I want, because what's she going to do? Cancel her precious granddaughter's wedding? She loves me too much to ever do that. I quietly put the wedding favor samples on her kitchen counter and wrote a quick note. Had an emergency, we'll talk later. Love, Grandma. Then I left, closing the door as softly as I could behind me. As I walked to my car, I kept thinking about what Jessica had said. She thought I was trapped. She thought I was too sweet, too naive, too desperate for her love to ever stand up for myself. She was about to learn how wrong she was about her grandmother. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I kept hearing Jessica's voice in my head. I hope she dies before the wedding. Those words played on repeat as I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally made it inside my house, I went straight to my bedroom and collapsed on the bed. I cried harder than I had since Harold died. This wasn't just about the money or the wedding planning. This was about discovering that someone I loved more than life itself actually wished I was dead. I spent the entire evening in that bedroom, going through every memory I had with Jessica, teaching her to bake cookies when she was 5, helping her with homework throughout elementary school, being there for every birthday, every school play, every important moment in her life, taking care of her when she was sick, supporting her through her first heartbreak, celebrating when she got her job. And through it all, I kept hearing her voice. She's so naive about business stuff. She thinks because she ran some little restaurant in the middle of nowhere, she understands contracts and vendor relationships. That comment hurt almost as much as the death wish. Jessica had dismissed 20 years of my business experience, like it was nothing. She had no idea what it took to run a restaurant, to manage vendors, to negotiate contracts, to handle the financial pressures of keeping a business alive. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Jessica laughing about how I was trapped by the contracts I'd signed. She thought I was some helpless old woman who'd gotten herself into a situation she couldn't get out of. The next morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wedding planning binder I'd put together. Months of work, months of excitement, months of believing I was doing something beautiful for someone I loved. But Jessica saw it all as interference and embarrassment. That's when I remembered something from my restaurant days. I walked to my home office and pulled out my filing cabinet, the same one I'd used for business contracts at Betty's Kitchen. I'd always kept meticulous records, always read every contract carefully, always understood exactly what I was signing. I pulled out every single wedding contract and spread them across my desk. The venue, the catering company, the florist, the photographer, the string quartet, the cake designer, even the limo service. One by one I read through each contract carefully, paying special attention to the cancellation clauses. What I discovered made me smile for the first time in 24 hours. Every single contract was signed by me as the primary client, not just as a guarantor or financial backer. This meant I wasn't just paying for services someone else had arranged. I was the actual customer, the one with decision-making authority, the one with cancellation rights. Even better, most of the contracts had 30-day cancellation clauses with varying penalty structures. Since the wedding was still 4 weeks away, I was well within the cancellation window for most services. I started doing calculations. I'd already paid $15,000 in deposits to various vendors. If I canceled everything now, I'd lose most of those deposits, but I'd avoid the remaining $65,000 in final payments that were due in the next 2 weeks. $15,000 was a lot of money to lose, but it was better than throwing away another $65,000 on someone who wished I was dead. I picked up the phone and called my attorney Robert Chen, the same man who'd handled Harold's estate. I'd worked with him during my restaurant years too, so he understood my business background. "Robert, I need some advice about contract cancellation," I said when he answered. "Of course, Betty. What's the situation?" I explained about the wedding contracts, though I didn't go into detail about what Jessica had said. I just told him I needed to understand my rights as the primary client on these agreements. "Let me be clear about this," Robert said after I'd outlined the situation. "You sign these contracts as the primary client, not as a guarantor. That means you have every right to cancel these services with appropriate notice. You'll lose your deposits, but you're not legally obligated to continue with services you no longer want." "Even though it's for my granddaughter's wedding?" I asked. "Betty, it doesn't matter who the wedding is for. You're the client. You're the one who contracted for these services. You can cancel them for any reason or no reason at all, as long as you follow the cancellation procedures outlined in each contract." That afternoon, I called my banker, Helen Morrison, who'd been handling my accounts since I'd opened the restaurant. I wanted to understand exactly what my financial position was. "Helen, I need to know my exact liquid assets," I said. "I'm considering making some changes to some significant commitments I've made." Helen pulled up my accounts. "Betty, between your savings, your CDs, and your money market accounts, you have about $450,000 in liquid assets. Plus your house is worth about $300,000, and it's completely paid off. And that doesn't include the inheritance from my sister Elizabeth last month?" "Oh, that's right. The estate settlement added another $400,000 to your portfolio. I hadn't included that in my initial calculation." I sat back in my chair. I had over $800,000 in liquid assets, plus a paid-off house. Jessica had guessed I had at least $1 million, and she wasn't wrong. But she had no idea that I'd recently inherited substantially more than that from my sister. "Helen, if I were to cancel some contracts and lose about $15,000 in deposits, how would that affect my financial position?" "Betty, $15,000 would be less than 2% of your liquid assets. You'd barely notice it financially speaking." That evening, I sat in my living room with a legal pad and made a list of every vendor. Next to each name, I wrote the deposit amount I'd lose, and the final payment amount I'd save by canceling. The math was simple. Lose $15,000, save $65,000. Net savings, $50,000. But this wasn't really about the money. This was about dignity and self-respect. I'd been in business long enough to know that you don't continue doing business with people who don't respect you. And you certainly don't fund the dreams of people who wish you were dead. I thought about Jessica's comment that I was too sweet to ever do anything to hurt her. She was right that I didn't want to hurt her. But I also wasn't going to continue financing someone who saw me as an embarrassing burden. I realized that Jessica had made two crucial mistakes. First, she'd assumed I was too emotionally invested to make a business decision. Second, she'd underestimated my business competence and legal understanding. She made herself the perfect victim, Jessica had said about me. She's paying for everything, she has no legal way to get out of it, and I can treat her however I want, because what's she going to do? But I wasn't a victim. I was a businesswoman who'd run a successful restaurant for 2 decades. I knew how to read contracts, how to manage vendor relationships, and how to make difficult decisions when necessary. The next morning, I called Robert again. Robert, I've decided to cancel all the wedding contracts. Can you help me make sure I do this properly? Of course, Betty. Do you want to tell me what's changed? Let's just say I've learned some things about the people I was trying to help, and I've decided my money would be better spent elsewhere. I understand. Let me review each contract and prepare the cancellation notices. We'll want to send them certified mail to ensure proper documentation. Perfect. And Robert? I want to be very clear about something. I'm not canceling because I'm angry or trying to punish anyone. I'm canceling because I refuse to fund people who don't respect me. That's a very reasonable business decision, Betty. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I booked a cruise, a 2-week Alaska cruise that I'd always wanted to take, but had never felt I could afford. It would cost exactly $50,000 for the luxury suite I'd always dreamed of. $50,000. The exact amount I'd save by canceling Jessica's wedding. As I gave the travel agent my credit card information, I realized something important. For the first time in 3 years, I was spending money on myself instead of on people who didn't appreciate me. I was done being the sweet, naive grandmother who could be taken advantage of. I was done funding people who wished I was dead. I was done accepting disrespect in exchange for the privilege of being generous. Jessica thought she had me figured out. She thought I was trapped, weak, and too loving to ever stand up for myself. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made myself breakfast, got dressed in my best business suit, and sat down at my desk with the stack of cancellation letters Robert had prepared. I started with the venue. Maple Ridge Country Club had been Jessica's dream location, with its beautiful gardens and elegant ballroom. I called the events coordinator, Mrs. Patterson, whom I'd worked with for months. Mrs. Patterson, this is Betty Richardson. I need to cancel the wedding reception scheduled for 4 weeks from Saturday. There was a pause. Oh my. Mrs. Richardson. I'm so sorry to hear that. Is everything all right? There have been some family circumstances that have made it necessary to cancel. I understand I'll forfeit my deposit. Yes, unfortunately the $3,000 deposit is non-refundable at this point, but you won't be responsible for the remaining $12,000 in final payments. That's exactly what I expected. Please send me written confirmation of the cancellation. Next was the catering company. 5-course dinner for 150 guests, with the balance of $10,000 due in 10 days. Elegant Events Catering. This is Monica. Monica. This is Betty Richardson. I need to cancel the catering service for the Richardson-Wilson wedding. Oh no. I'm so sorry to hear that, Mrs. Richardson. You'll lose your $2,000 deposit, but you won't owe the final payment. I understand. Please send me written confirmation. One by one, I methodically called every vendor, the florist, the photographer, the string quartet, the cake designer, the limo service. Each conversation was professional and brief. Each vendor expressed sympathy and confirmed the same thing. I'd lose my deposit but save thousands in final payments. By noon, I had canceled $80,000 worth of wedding services. I'd lost $15,000 in deposits, but I'd saved $65,000 in final payments. Then I sat back and waited. The first call came 2 days later. It was Thursday afternoon, and I was in my garden when my phone rang. "Grandma?" Jessica's voice was shaky. "I just got the strangest call from Maple Ridge Country Club. They said you canceled the reception venue? But that can't be right, can it? There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Jessica," I said calmly. "I canceled all the wedding vendors yesterday." "What? But why? What happened?" "I heard your conversation with Sarah on Tuesday. The one where you said you hoped I would die before the wedding, so you could get my inheritance and plan the wedding you actually wanted." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Grandma, I was just stressed. I didn't mean." "You calculated my net worth, Jessica. You said I was naive about business and that I was trapped by the contracts I'd signed. You called me an embarrassing burden and said you couldn't wait to stop pretending to care about my opinions." "I was just venting. I didn't mean any of it." "You meant every word, and you were wrong about something important. I'm not trapped by those contracts. I was the primary client, which means I had every right to cancel them, and I'm not naive about business. I spent 20 years successfully running a restaurant. But Grandma, the wedding is in 3 weeks. What am I supposed to do?" "That's not my problem to solve anymore, Jessica. You wanted to plan your own wedding without my interference. Now you can." The phone calls from the family started within hours. First Michael called, then Karen, then Brad. Each conversation was variations of the same theme: disbelief, anger, and desperate attempts to get me to change my mind. "Mom, you can't do this to Jessica," Michael said. "She's your granddaughter. She made a mistake, but she's young. She's 24 years old, Michael. She's old enough to understand that wishing someone dead while spending their money has consequences." "But she didn't mean it literally. She calculated my inheritance value and said she hoped I would die so she could get the money and plan a different wedding. How exactly am I supposed to interpret that?" Karen called next, crying. "Betty, please, you have to understand. Jessica is just overwhelmed with wedding planning. She loves you so much. If she loves me, she has a strange way of showing it. She removed my friends from the guest list, excluded me from vendor meetings, and dismissed every suggestion I made, all while I was paying for everything. We'll pay you back. We'll find a way to cover the costs." "With what money, Karen? You couldn't afford this wedding before I offered to pay for it." "Nothing has changed, except that Jessica showed me her true feelings." Brad called too. The poor young man. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm so sorry about what Jessica said. She was just stressed, and she didn't mean any of it. Please, isn't there some way we can work this out?" I almost felt sorry for him. He seemed genuinely shocked by what Jessica had said. "Brad, I'm not angry with you, but I'm not going to continue funding someone who wishes I was dead. Jessica is free to plan whatever wedding she can afford on her own." The most dramatic call came from Jessica herself the next day. She was sobbing hysterically. "Grandma, I called all the vendors. They want $65,000 to reinstate the services. We don't have that kind of money. You know we don't have that kind of money." "I know exactly what you can afford, Jessica. You were planning a $5,000 wedding before I offered to help. You can still have that wedding. But all my friends are expecting this beautiful wedding. The invitations are already sent. Everyone knows it's going to be at Maple Ridge. Then you'll have to explain to your friends why the plans changed. Perhaps you can tell them that you wished your grandmother was dead, and she decided not to fund your dream wedding anymore." "I didn't mean it. I was just frustrated." "Jessica, you didn't just say you were frustrated. You said you hoped I would die. You calculated how much money you'd inherit. You called me naive and said I was trapped. Those weren't words spoken in frustration. Those were your true feelings." "Please, Grandma, I'll apologize. I'll do anything. Just please don't ruin my wedding." "I'm not ruining your wedding, Jessica. I'm simply not paying for it anymore. You can still get married. You just can't do it on my dime while wishing I was dead." The calls continued for several days. Michael suggested family counseling. Karen offered to have Jessica write me a letter of apology. Brad's parents even called to offer to mediate. But I was done. I'd made my decision based on business principles that had served me well for decades. You don't continue doing business with people who don't respect you. 2 weeks later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Jessica and Brad were getting married at the local community center, with a reception in the fellowship hall. The invitation was printed on simple cardstock, nothing like the elegant letterpress invitations that had been ordered for the original wedding. I didn't attend. Instead, I was on a cruise ship in Alaska, watching glaciers from the deck of my luxury suite. I'd used the money I'd saved from canceling Jessica's wedding to give myself the trip of a lifetime. The cruise was everything I dreamed it would be. I made new friends, saw incredible sights, and enjoyed the kind of luxury I'd never allowed myself before. For the first time in years, I was spending money on someone who appreciated it, myself. When I returned home, I found a thank you card from Jessica in my mailbox. It was a simple card with a photo from her wedding. She and Brad looked happy, standing in front of a simple backdrop in the community center. Inside, she'd written, "Dear Grandma, thank you for everything you taught me about respect and consequences. I understand now why you made the decision you did. I hope someday I can earn back your trust and your love. Love, Jessica." I kept the card, but I didn't call her. Some lessons take time to fully sink in, and I wanted to make sure Jessica truly understood what she'd lost before I considered rebuilding our relationship. 3 months later, I updated my will. Jessica's inheritance went to several charities instead. I also established a scholarship fund for young women starting their own businesses, using the money I'd originally planned to leave to someone who had wished I was dead. I learned something important during this whole experience. It's never too late to demand respect. At 68 years old, I discovered that I still had the power to make choices that honored my own dignity and self-worth. Jessica got married, just not the wedding she'd planned, and I got something more valuable than any wedding could have provided. I got my self-respect back. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes generosity means stopping the flow of money to people who don't appreciate it. And sometimes the best gift you can give someone is to let them experience the consequences of their own choices. My money, my choice, my dignity was worth more than any wedding, and I sleep peacefully knowing that I don't fund people who wish me dead. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect your own dignity, even when it meant disappointing someone you loved? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine.